On this episode of Andy's Autosport TV, we're going to talk to you about how to monitor your engine's vitals with gauges and which ones are important for your application. Now, gauges are what's going to monitor your modifications, such as boost, nitrous, or any other external modifications you've made to your engine. These are important when you have performance modifications to make sure your vehicle is operating correctly. Now, the factory gauges in your car are very accurate, but they don't have a numeric range usually. Normally, they just have a hot and cold and a normal. And they also won't monitor your engine's performance modifications. All right, the first gauge we're going to talk about is an air-fuel ratio gauge. Now, there are two different types. They have an air-fuel ratio gauge, which is typically a narrow band meter, which basically measures off of 1 volt, and then they have a wide band O2 sensor, which is also an air-fuel ratio gauge. It measures off of 5 volts. Now, how this works and how they differ is the narrow band gauge actually is pretty slow to react because there's no heating element and it's only measuring off that 1 volt. A wideband O2 sensor, it reacts very quickly because it has a heating element built into the oxygen sensor. So when that gauge warms up, it takes 15 or 20 seconds for it to get to normal operating temperature. Now it has a 5 volt range to measure your air-fuel ratio. Air-fuel ratio between 10 to 1, which is extremely rich, or 20 to 1, which is extremely lean. So that wideband air-fuel ratio is much more accurate and responds very quickly. This is important because not only is it critical to get the maximum amount of horsepower out of your vehicle, but it's also critical to engine longevity. For example, if you are running too lean, you can blow a head gasket or even burn a piston. Too rich, and you're going to contaminate your oil, and this can cause catastrophic failure as well. Now, when you take your vehicle to a shop to have it dyno tuned, the #1 tool they use is a wideband O2 sensor. If you're going to run a boosted car or a nitrous car, this is especially critical, and in my opinion, one of the first gauges you need to purchase. All right, the next gauge we're going to talk about is a boost gauge. Now, what it measures is the positive pressure in the manifold. So if you're turbocharged or supercharged, this is going to tell you how much boost you're actually putting into the engine. This is especially critical on diesel trucks. All right, the next gauge is going to be a boost vacuum gauge. Now, this is designed for gasoline engines that actually have a vacuum when the engine isn't under boost. This also measures the positive pressure in the intake manifold, just like the boost gauge alone. All right, now the next gauge we're going to talk about is fuel pressure gauge. Now, fuel pressure gauges can be used with carburetors or fuel injection, and this is mainly used to make sure that your fuel system is able to keep up with your boosted or carbureted vehicle. Oil is the lifeblood of your car, so oil pressure is just like monitoring your blood pressure in yourself. Anytime you do any modifications to your vehicle, this is one of those gauges that should be on your must-have list. Now, oil pressure is important, we know, and I believe that oil temperature is just as important and should be on everybody's must-have list. Now, this gauge is often overlooked, but think about your oil as your lifeblood once again. If it's not at its proper viscosity or at its proper temperature and flowing correctly, it's not going to keep those metal parts from rubbing against each other. Now, the next gauge we're going to talk about is a water temperature gauge. Now, we all know that when you add all those hot rod parts, you're going to create more heat because we know that heat is power. The best way to do this is to monitor it with a water temperature gauge. Now, another gauge is an aftermarket tachometer. Now, most vehicles come with factory tachometers these days, and they're relatively accurate. They're accurate enough to do what you need them to do. However, if you are going to do any kind of racing where you're going to be accelerating really fast once you make heavy modifications, an aftermarket tach is a good idea because a lot of them come with shift lights, so you never have to take your eyes off the road, and you'll still know when to shift. Now, the next gauge we're going to talk about is a voltmeter or an amp gauge. Now, what this does is this basically just monitors your engine's electrical system. Now, this used to be very critical, and they actually used it in the old days on the old school hot rods that came in every one of those little gauge clusters, because this is how you could tell if you pitched an alternator belt, which also was the water pump belt, which could cause catastrophic failure. Not so critical these days, but if you need to monitor your engine's electrical system, this is a great way to do it. Now, the next gauge we're going to talk about is EGT, or exhaust gas temperature. Now, if you have a boosted diesel vehicle, this is very important. Now, we all know that heat is power, but it can also be catastrophic. An EGT gauge is going to keep you this side of catastrophe on your boosted diesel vehicle. Now, you can tailor your gauge package for your particular application, but whether you're boosted, nitrous, or naturally aspirated, in my opinion, there are 4 critical gauges: water temperature, oil pressure, and some sort of air-fuel ratio gauge. Now today we're talking about gauges, but if you want to see how to install them, check out our installation video of our Project Diesel F250 or Project Integra at Andy's Autosport TV. Now when it comes to buying gauges, there are actually different styles, colors, and sizes. Now if you get an analog style gauge and you do a lot of heavy duty extreme off-roading or drag racing where there's a lot of vibration involved, you might want to look into a liquid filled gauge. The liquid actually dampens the needle so that it doesn't bounce around under that hard use. Then you basically have two different ways that gauges read. You have them that read electrically, and then you have mechanical gauges. Now, in my opinion, a mechanical gauge is better, even though they both read perfectly accurate. What happens is, let's take an oil pressure gauge, for example. A mechanical oil pressure gauge is going to be connected to an oil pressure port, and it's going to have a metal line that physically connects to the back of the gauge, giving it a mechanical connection. An electric gauge is going to have a sending unit there, and it's going to be connected by a wire. Now they're both just as accurate. However, if you have an electrical problem, now you don't know if that gauge is reading properly or not. Now another type of gauge that they have are digital gauges like we have here on our table from GlowShift. Now they have both styles. They have an analog style that has a digital readout as well, and then they have just the straight digital readout. Now they come in both mechanical and electric, so it's all about the preference and what you want to see in your car. Now, as we said, there are also several different size gauges. You have a 2 1/16, which is the most common size for gauge pods and the like. Then there's a 2 5/8, a 3 3/8, and a 5-inch gauge. Now, when you're ordering your gauge pods from andysautosport.com and you're picking the gauges to go with it, make sure that the sizes match up so that when you get your gauges, you can install them without any problems. All in all, you want to make sure that any modifications you make to your vehicle are monitored. Accurately monitoring your engine's vitals is important for engine performance and longevity. Whether you have a turbo diesel pickup truck, a nitrous hot rod, or a boosted import car, an aftermarket set of gauges is exactly what you need. Popular brands we carry are GlowShift, Autometer, and Intellitronics. Check out the link below to see what we have available for your vehicle. If you have any questions, feel free to call one of our knowledgeable sales staff at 1-800-419-1152 or email us at info@andysautosport.com. And once you get your ride completely modified, make sure you send us pictures to customer.rides@andysautosport.com. We may feature your car on our webpage. We hope you've learned something today, and we'll see you on another episode of Andy's Autosport TV.